Imagine standing in Lagos on the evening of October 20, 2020. You have your Nigerian flag in your hand. You are surrounded by thousands of young Nigerians. People are singing the national anthem. Some are praying. Some are filming everything with their phones. And some people are simply standing there, hoping that somehow this protest will finally make the government listen. Then suddenly soldiers arrive, and within minutes everything changes. That night became one of the most painful nights in recent Nigerian history. You probably know the name already, Lekki Toll Gate. But what actually happened there? What brought those young Nigerians to the toll gate in the first place? Why were soldiers sent there? What happened when the shooting started? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how many people actually died? Today, let's forget the rumors for a moment. Let's forget the argument on Twitter. Let's forget the political sides. Let's just go through what we can actually establish from the evidence, eyewitness accounts, official records, and the Lagos Judicial Panel of Inquiry. Because the story of EndSARS didn't begin at Lekki Toll Gate, it started much earlier. So, what was EndSARS actually about? To understand Lekki, you first have to understand SARS. SARS stood for the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, a police unit created for fighting serious crimes like armed robbery. But over the years, SARS became widely accused of abuses, including arbitrary arrest, torture, extortion, and extrajudicial killings. For many young Nigerians, especially young men, encounters with SARS could become terrifying. Your clothes could make you suspicious. Your hairstyle could make you suspicious. Having an expensive looking phone could make you suspicious. Driving a nice car could make you suspicious. And simply looking like someone the police considered a Yahoo boy could be enough to attract attention. Now, it is important to be fair here. SARS were created to fight criminals. Not every SARS officer was abusive, and the unit did arrest criminals. But there had been years of complaints about abuses by members of the unit. And by 2020, many young Nigerians were simply tired. Then in early October 2020, another incident went viral on social media. A video circulated showing an alleged SARS operation involving the shooting of a young man in Delta State. The video sparked outrage, and Nigerians started using a hashtag that had actually existed for years. Hashtag EndSARS. This time around, however, something was different. The hashtag didn't remain on Twitter. It moved from people's phones into the streets. By around October 8, protests were spreading. Young Nigerians came out in Lagos, Abuja, Benin, Port Harcourt, Ibadan, Enugu, Osogbo, and other cities. And this wasn't just one political party. It wasn't one ethnic group. It wasn't one religious group. It was largely a youth-driven movement. People were saying enough. Enough police brutality, enough unlawful arrest, enough of extortion, enough of killings, enough of impunity. And eventually, the protesters presented 5 major demands. They wanted arrested protesters released. They wanted justice and compensation for victims of police brutality. They wanted an independent body to investigate and prosecute police misconduct. They wanted psychological evaluation and retraining of former SARS officers before redeployment. And they wanted better pay for police officers. They became known as the 5 demands. And here is something interesting. And government actually responded quite quickly to the first major demand. On October 11, the Inspector General of Police announced the immediate dissolution of SARS across Nigeria. President Muhammadu Buhari addressed the nation the following day. And on October 13, the Presidential Panel on Police Reform formally accepted the 5-point demands. So you might think, okay, SARS has been disbanded, problem solved. Not quite, because Nigerians did not trust that announcement. Many people had had promises of police reform before, and then the government announced a replacement unit called SWAT. the Special Weapons and Tactics Team. For many protesters, that looked like SARS was simply being given a new name. The protests continued, and in Lagos, one location became the heart of the movement, the Lekki Toll Gate. Why the Lekki became so important? If you were following the protest at that time, you probably remember the pictures. Young Nigerians gathered around the toll gate. There were DJs, there were musicians, there were food vendors, people donated food and water, medical volunteers were around, some people were providing legal assistance, others were simply there to support the movement. It became almost like a community, and social media made everything even bigger. Someone could be standing at Lekki Toll Gate and live stream what was happening to thousands of people watching from their phones. That was one of the most remarkable things about EndSARS. The protesters did not need a traditional television station to tell their story. They were broadcasting themselves. But as days passed, tensions across Nigeria became increasingly serious. There were clashes in different places. Security forces were deployed in several locations, and violence began occurring in some areas. The Lagos state government eventually imposed a curfew on October 20. That day would become the turning point. Now, let's slow this part down, because this is where the story gets complicated, and this is where we have to be very careful with facts. On October 20th, protesters were still gathered around Lekki Toll Gate. There were thousands of people there. The atmosphere during much of the day was still that of a protest. Videos from earlier in the day showed people singing, dancing, speaking and waving Nigerian flags. But there was growing tension. The Lagos state government had announced a curfew, and security forces were deployed around Lagos. The Nigerian army was eventually deployed to Lekki Toll Gate. The government's explanation was that security forces were needed because the situation in Lagos had deteriorated and other security agencies were overwhelmed. The government later maintained that the soldiers were operating under rules of engagement and that they fired blank ammunition into the air. But this is where evidence became very important, because independent investigations and the Lagos Judicial Panel reached a very different conclusion. According to the Amnesty International's investigation, Nigerian army vehicles left Bonny camp at approximately 6:29 p.m. The vehicles were tracked moving towards Lekki Toll Gate. At about 6:45 p.m., soldiers arrived at the protest area. Amnesty's investigation concluded that soldiers opened fire on protesters. Human Rights Watch later conducted its own investigation and also found evidence that soldiers fired towards protesters. And the Lagos Judicial Panel of Inquiry, after hearing testimony and examining evidence, concluded that Nigerian army personnel shot, injured and killed unarmed protesters. That finding is important because it wasn't simply a social media allegation. It came from a formal judicial inquiry that had evidence from witnesses, victims, government officials, security agencies, medical personnel, and other parties. The panel concluded that the army had not followed its own rules of engagement. It also found out that the army's conduct contributed to the deaths and injuries at the toll gates. But were they using live ammunition? This is one of the most controversial parts of the entire story. The Nigerian government said that soldiers fired blank ammunition. A government spokesperson argued that blank ammunition could not have caused deaths being attributed to the army. There were also ballistic experts who gave evidence to the panel, but other evidence pointed in the opposite direction. A forensic company that testified before the Lagos panel said cartridge casing recovered from Lekki were of the same caliber as Nigerian army live ammunition. And the Lagos Judicial Panel ultimately concluded that the army had fired live bullets at protesters. However, not everyone agrees the army used live ammunition. They didn't. The government disputed it, but the Lagos Judicial Panel found that live ammunition was used and that soldiers killed and injured protesters. That is the factual distinction. This is where the atmosphere at Lekki changed completely. According to the accounts presented to the panel and independent investigations, soldiers were moved towards the toll gate. The crowd began reacting. People raised their Nigerian flags. The lights at the toll gate were switched off. The shooting began. People ran. Others dropped to the ground. Some tried to help the injured. And because many protesters were recording the event on their phones, footage from the night spread rapidly across Nigerian social media. Some people were screaming. Some were calling friends and family. Some were trying to get medical help, and some were simply trying to survive. Amnesty International's investigation placed the beginning of the shooting at about 6:45 p.m. and said the violence continued into the evening. What about the Nigerian flag? This detail became one of the most powerful symbols of the night. Videos showed protesters holding Nigerian flags and singing the national anthem. The Lagos Judicial Panel specifically referenced this in its finding. The panel said that the protesters were unarmed and that some were waving Nigerian flags and singing the national anthem when they were shot. The panel described the manner of the assault and killing as a massacre in context. That is why the phrase Lekki massacre became so strongly associated with October 20. It wasn't simply because social media called it a massacre. The Lagos Judicial Panel itself used that description. So, how many people actually died? This is where we need to slow down again, because you have probably had very different numbers. Some people say dozens, some say hundreds, some say nobody died. Neither of those extremes represents what the available evidence establishes. Amnesty International said that its investigation identified at least 12 people killed at Lekki and Alausa combined on October 20, 2020. The Lagos Judicial Panel's Lekki investigation listed 48 casualties connected to the incident. Of those, the report identified 9 confirmed deaths and 4 people presumed dead, alongside people who suffered gunshot injuries and assaults. The panel also considered evidence involving 96 corpses presented by a forensic pathologist, but it did not accept all of those bodies as deaths that could be conclusively linked to the Lekki Toll Gate incident. The Lagos panel established confirmed and presumed deaths connected to the incident, but the exact number of people killed specifically at Lekki remains disputed, and there is no reliable evidence establishing the popular claim that hundreds of people were killed there that night. That is important because when you are telling this story, you don't need to exaggerate something that was already tragic. And then came the bodies. One of the most disturbing parts of the investigation involved allegations that bodies were removed from the scene. The judicial panel had testimony about bodies being taken away in military vehicles. One protester, Olalekan Sanusi, testified through video about being shot and left for dead. He said that he was placed in a vehicle where he saw bodies. The panel considered this evidence. Human Rights Watch also reported witness accounts that soldiers removed bodies from the area. But again, be careful with the wording. You shouldn't say the army secretly transported hundreds of dead bodies away. That is not established. What the evidence suggests is that witnesses reported bodies being removed, and the panel considered evidence that security personnel removed bodies from the scene. That is the difference between storytelling and spreading rumors. Another major controversy involved the CCTV cameras at the toll gate. The Lekki Concession Company operated the toll plaza and was responsible for the cameras. The Lagos panel found that some cameras had been removed and that they were not presented to the panel. The panel said that those cameras could have helped establish exactly what happened that night. This became one of the reasons suspicion around the incident became even stronger. People were saying, if the cameras were there, why can't we simply watch the full footage? And the question still matters when we discuss Lekki today. The story of EndSARS wasn't only about Lekki. This is very important. Across Nigeria, protesters were killed, injured, and arrested. There were clashes between protesters, security forces, and other groups. There were attacks on police stations. There was destruction of public and private properties. There were attacks on correctional facilities. There were businesses destroyed. and there was widespread violence in parts of the country after October 20. The government documented extensive destruction and loss of life during the unrest. So if someone tells you EndSARS was completely peaceful everywhere, that is not accurate. And if someone tells you EndSARS was simply a violent riot from the beginning, that isn't accurate either. The movement began as a mass protest against police brutality. It was predominantly peaceful in many places, but as the crisis escalated, violence and destruction occurred in several parts of the country. Both things can be true. What happened after October 2020? After the Lekki shooting, the entire country changed. People were angry, people were frightened, and social media was flooded with videos and photographs from the protest. International attention increased. The Nigerian government rejected claims that a massacre had taken place. Government officials reportedly challenged reports about the number of deaths and the use of live ammunition. Meanwhile, activists, journalists, and human rights organizations continued demanding an independent investigation, and eventually, Lagos established a Judicial Panel of Inquiry. The panel began hearing from victims, witnesses, security officials, government officials, medical professionals, and other stakeholders. That investigation went for months. Then came November 15, 2021. More than a year after the shooting, the Lagos Judicial Panel submitted its report, and its findings were significant. The panel found that the army was culpable. It concluded that soldiers shot at unarmed protesters. It found that protesters were killed and injured. It found that army did not comply with its rules of engagement. It also found out that police officers were present around the area and that police officers shot at and assaulted protesters. And as we already mentioned, the panel described the incident as a massacre in context. The federal government rejected important parts of the panel's conclusions. Then the Minister of Information, Lai Mohammed, publicly argued that the report contained contradictions and errors, particularly regarding the number and causes of deaths and the use of military-grade ammunition. So even after the report, the disagreement did not disappear. It simply moved from the streets to the courtroom of public opinion. After going through the evidence, here is the simplest way I'll put it. On October 20, 2020, thousands of people were gathered at Lekki Toll Gate as part of the EndSARS protests. The Lagos government had imposed a curfew. The Nigerian army was deployed to the area. Soldiers arrived at the toll gate in the evening. Gunfire followed. People were injured. People died. The Lagos Judicial Panel concluded that soldiers shot unarmed protesters and that live ammunition was used. The government disputed that conclusion and maintained that soldiers fired blanks and did not deliberately kill protesters. The panel identified 48 casualties connected to the Lekki incident, including 9 confirmed dead and 4 presumed dead. Amnesty International independently reported at least 12 deaths across Lekki and Alausa on October 20. And although there were many allegations about the large numbers, there is no solid evidence establishing a death toll in the hundreds at Lekki Toll Gate. That is what the evidence allows us to say confidently. But maybe the bigger story is not just Lekki, because when you look back at EndSARS, something becomes clear. The protests were not really born on October 8. The anger had been building for years. It came from young Nigerians who had stories. Someone had been stopped because of their phone. Someone had been arrested because of their appearance. Someone had been beaten. Someone had lost a relative. Someone had paid money just to avoid being detained. And someone else had simply reached the point where they said, this has to stop. That is why the hashtag became bigger than SARS itself. It became a conversation about police accountability. It became a conversation about governance. It became a conversation about what young Nigerians expected from their country. And Lekki became the symbol of what happened when that conversation met the force of the state. 5 years later, why are we still talking about it? Because history isn't just about date, it is about memory. October 20, 2020 is still remembered because thousands of ordinary Nigerians went into the streets believing that their voices could make a difference. Some came with flags, some came with food, some came with medical supplies, some came with cameras, some came simply because they wanted to stand with their fellow Nigerians. And on that night at Lekki, people were shot. The precise number of deaths remained contested, but the fact that people were killed and injured is not something we can honestly erase from the historical record. The Lagos Judicial Panel established that independent human rights investigation established death and injuries, and testimony of victims and witnesses became part of the official record. So perhaps the most honest way to remember Lekki isn't to repeat every number we see online. It is to remember the people, and to remember the question that brought them there in the first place. What happens when citizens stop believing that the people meant to protect them will actually protect them? That is the question behind EndSARS, and that is the question behind Lekki. And honestly, that probably is why even years later, Nigerians still say, "Soro Soke, speak up," because October 20, 2020 wasn't just another date on the Nigerian calendar. For an entire generation, it became a memory, a warning, and a demand: never again. The Lekki Toll Gate massacre is one that will remain indelible in the annals of Nigerian history. For more of this, share, subscribe, and comment your opinion on the comment section.